I did this story, and it's called Journey of Survival, My Father's Story. Many of you have heard many parts of this story over the years, both in Sydenham Shul and in Torah Academy Shul. And many of you knew my late parents, Aleichem Hasholem. And some of you may have heard some of these stories from my father himself in his visits here. He did eventually put it into a book form in English, From Shedlitz to Safety. That's the town he was born in, Poland. It's not in the bookshops, I'm afraid, but it is available on Amazon if anybody would like to hear the full story. I'm going to give a brief summary of his life in less than half an hour. So my father was born, Reb Shimon ben Shmuel Zalman Goldman, in a little town called Shedlitz, Poland. As he described it, 2 train stops from Warsaw. 15,000 Jews in that city or town. He was born on Hay Teves, 1st of January 1925, one of 6 children. His father was Shmuel Zalman, his mother Menucha Kreindl, and Hashem Yinkem Domam. He came from a very distinguished lineage. His parents traced their lineage back to the Chidushei Horim. That's Rabbi Yitzchok Meir of Gur, the first Gerer Rebbe, great Torah scholar. He's known by the name of his works, Chidushei Horim, the Torah innovations of the Rim, Rabbi Yitzchok Meir. And also the Yid HaKodesh, they called him the Holy Jew, one of the Polish Rebbes of previous generations. It was only after my father passed away that I actually looked up on Wikipedia, because I was writing something up about his life and I wanted to get the exact years when the Chidushei Harim lived. And I discovered that the Chidushei Harim himself traced his lineage back to Rashi and the Maram of Rothenburg, who actually is mentioned in one of the Kinnos on Tisha B'Av that we read today. Is his story, how he was kidnapped and held for ransom, and how he died in captivity. The Maram of Rothenburg. So my father, who left home at 14, as we'll soon tell you, didn't even know, to the best of my knowledge, that his ancestor, Chidushei Harim, stemmed from Rashi and the Maram of Rothenburg. So amazing what you can learn on Wikipedia these days. Over the years growing up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York, my father did not really speak very much. As we heard last night from Ella Blumenthal, that heroic survivor, it was very painful and too painful to talk about. And most survivors didn't talk. There's been studies written about survivors and the children of survivors, and it was too difficult for them to talk about it. We heard a little bit here, a bit there, bits and pieces, but we really didn't know very much. And ironically, it was on a visit to Johannesburg in 1990 at my son Mendel's bar mitzvah, which was his birthday is Yud Tammuz. My parents were here for a little bit afterwards. It's the American vacation time, so they didn't have to run back. And I was then doing the Jewish Sound radio program, which I did for some 24 years, every Sunday night, an hour, long before Chai FM. There we have a whole station, but then we just had 1 hour a week on a Sunday evening, the Jewish Sound. Because it was the 3 weeks from the 17th of Tammuz, I didn't play any music in that hour, so I was looking to fill the time of an hour with conversation, looking for something meaningful. And I thought, well, let me try. I didn't really hold out much hope, but I asked my father, maybe you'll join me on the radio and I'll interview you and you can tell your story of how you survived Europe. And to my absolute shock, he agreed. And so we went into the studio of the Jewish Sound, which was the same studios as old 702 back in town, in Atkinson House, just off Elof Street. And I interviewed my father. And I had enough material for over 2 weeks. In fact, I still have 2 cassette tapes of this interview, which I just reminded myself I must digitalize quickly. And here I am playing the role not of a son, but of an objective, dispassionate interviewer asking my father questions. And I'm discovering things about my grandparents and uncles and aunts and my father's early life and cheder and different yeshivas. I never heard of these things. And it was such almost a surreal experience, sort of playing objective interviewer while a son is hearing his father's story for the first time. And I think that maybe broke the ice for my father, because when he got back home, again, we were always prodding him to tell the story, and eventually he agreed, and he recorded his life story on tape in Yiddish, which was his home language. And although he spoke a fluent English, but Yiddish was still remained his first language all his life. And so he spoke in Yiddish. And later, my brother-in-law, Rabbi Moshe Klein, and I think Rabbi Moshe Maranovsky of the Krach Chabad magazine in Israel, translated it into Hebrew. And it was published in serial form, chapter by chapter, week by week, in the Krach Chabad magazine in Israel in Hebrew. And when that came to an end, many, many people were really clamoring and begging my father to get it published in English. And eventually he had it translated into English, and I helped him with the editing and getting the book cover designed and getting people to typeset it and getting it to be published. And eventually it was published from Shedlitz to Safety, was published in English in 2004. And he said, look, he's not looking to write a bestseller. He just wants his grandchildren and one day his great-grandchildren, they should know the story of where they came from. And so that's when I first heard the story. And in the book, he tells the story of his bar mitzvah. He was already at age 12 studying in an out-of-town cheder, or yeshiva ktana. So he's in a little town called Stashov in Poland, and he's 12 years old, and it's coming to his bar mitzvah. His parents did not bring him home for his bar mitzvah. They did not travel to Stashov for their bar mitzvah, for his bar mitzvah. They didn't have much money. What he did get was a parcel in the post. He writes it was a blue box, a blue parcel arrived in the post in Stashov from Shedlitz, from his parents, which had a letter and a pair of tefillin. And the letter said, this is tefillin for you. You're becoming bar mitzvah. You must now put on the tefillin every day and make sure you have an aliyah to the Torah for your bar mitzvah. That was it. Today we have children who sadly have studied their bar mitzvahs for a year, and now they can't have a proper bar mitzvah in shul. They're lucky they have a minyan, maybe at school or whatever. My father didn't even have that. He certainly didn't have a dinner dance. He didn't even have a bracha. He didn't have kichel and herring. He had tefillin and an aliyah to the Torah. And when you think about it, at the end of the day, that's the most important preparation for a young boy becoming an adult Jew. Torah and mitzvahs, symbolized by tefillin, and it stood him in good stead. I never heard him complain that he didn't have a bar mitzvah party. He gave me and my brother very beautiful bar mitzvah celebrations, but he never had one. He also studied in different yeshivas. He studied in Warsaw for a while in the Lubavitch yeshiva, which would set the stage later. Even though he came from a family of Ger Hasidim, Polish Hasidim, he later would join Lubavitch, as I'll tell you now. So he was walking in the street of Shedlitz with his father when Germany invaded Poland, 1939. And they were walking in the street, and suddenly out of the sky came German Stuka dive bombers. And they were strafing the city with machine gun fire. And his father threw him face down into a cabbage patch nearby. And they said Vidui, they said Shema Yisrael. My Zayda, who I never met, I don't even have a picture of, said the last words that you're supposed to say before you die with my father. Fortunately, they were spared. At my son Yochanan's bar mitzvah, our first of 8 bar mitzvahs in Sidnam Shul back in just after Pesach, 1987, my father and mother came. They came to all the bar mitzvahs. They loved coming to South Africa. They loved Sidnam Shul. At the brocha in the Sea Fall after the davening, there were hundreds of people. It was a big crush of people. But my father spontaneously said he'd like to say a few words. So it wasn't easy to get people quiet, but we did our best. And my father stood up and told this story of the cabbage patch. He said he was sitting in Sidnam Shul today, 1987, and he's thinking back, his memory is taken back to his hometown in Poland, and he's remembering this story with the dive bombers, the Nazi dive bombers machine gunning the city. They were so low, he said, you could hear them laughing in their planes as they shot up the city. And there he was lying down saying the last words that you say before you meet your maker, assuming this is the end of his life, age 14. And here he is now, 1987, in Johannesburg, South Africa, celebrating the bar mitzvah of his eldest son. I remember Tzemach Mendel telling me afterwards it was the most inspirational speech he's ever heard in his life. That was one experience. The other experience was that the Germans who had come into the town wanted to get into a particular shop that had kitchenware. And they held my father hostage until a young lady would go and get the key to give them access to the things in the shop. And my father thought, who knows, they'll kill him. The girl did come back, thank God. And she opened the shop for the German soldiers, and they released my father. But those two experiences convinced him that he has to get out of here, and he has to escape Poland somehow. His parents didn't want to leave. A, they had no money, they had no provisions to leave, and B, who could imagine that a sophisticated, seemingly civilized country like Germany would embrace something like a final solution to exterminate a whole nation of people. It was beyond belief. And my father, though he was not a rebellious person, he was not all that adventurous or risk-taking by nature, it was totally uncharacteristic of him, but he ran away from home. He was in a bread line with his mother, and when she turned, he slipped away, and he joined up with a family that was leaving town to get across, to get out of Poland. They said he could join them. Many people were leaving. And so he joined them. And they went across the river, and they managed to go to few different towns, and eventually he wound up in Vilna, Lithuania. And because he had studied in Lubavitch Yeshiva in Warsaw, he discovered the Lubavitch Yeshiva in Vilna, and he joined that yeshiva. So the yeshiva looked after him as they looked after the rest of the students. It wasn't very luxurious. They would have to go to a different family every day to eat supper. Didn't have much more. He escaped with basically 2 shirts, not the shirt on his back, the 2 shirts on his back. He had 2 shirts, so he put one over the other, and that's all. He had no money, he had no nothing, and but he became a yeshiva student there in Vilna, and so, however, his fellow yeshiva students fared, so did he. Reb Chaim Oizer, the famous Rav of Vilna, Reb Chaim Oizer Guzinski, one of the great rabbis of that generation, was the leader of Vilna Jewry at that time. He was already a very old man. In fact, while my father was in Vilna, Reb Chaim Oizer passed away, and it was a Friday. My father told us that the Rabbonim of Vilna were having a debate whether they should have the funeral of the great Reb Chaim Oizer on the Friday, same day, which is of course a mitzvah. But they weighed that up against the fact that if they delayed it till Sunday, then every yeshiva in Lithuania, all the great yeshivas of Lithuania, would all come with all their students to pay honor to the great Reb Chaim Oizer on Sunday. So it would be much more kavod and respect for him if they waited till Sunday. And the arguments went back and forth. In the end, they decided to wait till Sunday. And my father and his fellow Lubavitch Yeshiva students did the shmirah, did the vachting for Reb Chaim Oizer over Shabbos. So he had that interesting schus and experience. They were trying to get out of Lithuania and out of Europe. And all the students in Lubavitch Yeshiva wanted to join the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson of righteous memory, who in 1940, in March of 1940, on the 9th of Adar, arrived in New York by boat, managing miraculously to get out of Warsaw, Poland, where he was, and he was actually caught during the bombing of Warsaw by the Germans. And thank God he was able to get out, and with great miracles, he was able to get out of Europe, and in 1940 established Lubavitch in New York in an official way. There were Lubavitch Hasidim there before, and eventually they bought the house, 770 Eastern Parkway, where the previous Rebbe also lived upstairs and had the shul downstairs. And they wanted to get to America to be with the Rebbe. But how do you get out of Europe? How do you get visas? And help came from an unexpected way. As many of you have already heard the story of Chuni Sugihara, the legendary, heroic, righteous Japanese diplomat who was the consul in Kovna, which is another Lithuanian city, Kaunas. And he managed, there were hundreds of Jewish, Polish refugees who were clamoring, standing at the gates of, we showed the film about Sugihara's story last Tisha B'Av at Sidney Shul. So many of you are familiar with the story. And against the instructions of his government, his superiors in Tokyo, Sugihara decided to go with his conscience and to save lives. These Jews, he just met Jews for the first time in his life then, and he issued transit visas allowing thousands of Jews to get out of Europe. It was a transit visa to Japan. You had to go somewhere else. You couldn't stay in Japan. Some had some documents that you could go to Curacao, a Dutch colony, without a visa. My father actually writes in the book that they were officially planning to go to Vietnam from Japan. At any rate, they got these transit visas, and the whole yeshiva got the visas. My father didn't have a passport. You can't travel without a passport. He had postcard correspondence with his mother still. In the book, there are pictures of the postcards. One postcard has the stamp. You see the swastika on the Polish postcard already. The first postcard, his mother, my grandmother, who I never saw a picture of either, said she was upset that he left. How's he going to manage? He doesn't have money or anything. The next postcard, things had deteriorated. She said, it's a pity you didn't take your younger brother with you. And in subsequent postcards, she asked, does he have any money? Does he have any provisions that he could send them because they are completely destitute and starving? So they got the Sugihara visas, and the Rebbe and the Rebbe's organization, the Rashag, his son-in-law, was heading up that committee in New York. They sent American dollars to Vilna for the passage by train for all the students of Lubavitch Yeshiva to go from Vilna. They went to Minsk and then Moscow, and then the Trans-Siberian Railway across all of Russia, which spans 2 continents, to the Asian port of Vladivostok, and there by boat to Japan. He says Russian ships were sailing alongside them in the sea as they left Vladivostok. They were worried that these Russians would board the ship and take them back to Russia. Getting out of German clutches was one thing, but Russia was only a little bit better than the Nazis to the Jews. Rachel's grandfather was shot by the KGB for being a moil in Russia, so they didn't want to be in Russian hands either. And eventually the Russian ships turned back and they made it safely to the port in Japan, and from there by train to Kobe, Japan. In Kobe, there was a Jewish community that looked after the refugees who were coming. And then they were in Kobe for a few months, but then trying to get out and trying to get to America, they thought the best bet was to go to Shanghai. Shanghai, China was an open port. They went by boat together with the Mir Yeshiva. In Shanghai, there were about half a dozen yeshivas. Mir Yeshiva, all 300 students in Mir got Sugihara visas, and they went on the same boat with the few dozen in the Lubavitch Yeshiva to Shanghai, which was an open port and you didn't need a visa. In Shanghai, there was a big Jewish community. There were 20,000 refugees just from Germany and thousands more from other countries in Europe. And there was a Jewish ghetto in Shanghai. There was a Rav Meir Ashkenazi, the Zayda of Rabbi Mordechai Ashkenazi, who was the Rav in Kfar Chabad until recently. Now his son is. There was a Shochet. My father says they got kosher meat for the first time in ages. It was such a treat for them because actually the doctor examined them in Shanghai and they were all suffering from malnutrition. Trying to make a long story short, and let's see where we go from here. On the 7th of December, 1941, of course, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and then America got really involved. And eventually, when Japan was defeated in the war, they said, my father said, you would hear and see American aircraft, American military aircraft attacking Japan, and they would be flying over Shanghai, and they were worried that they would get bombed by American aircraft. He says in Poland, they were worried about being bombed by German aircraft. Now ironically, they're being worried about getting bombed by American aircraft, but thank God that didn't happen. They were in Shanghai for 5 long years. He writes that at one point they realized, the news came from Europe, of the extermination of 6 million Jews. They tried to get word from their families, my father and his fellow students, and they were pretty much all in the same boat. And at one point they realized that they were orphaned, that they had nobody left in this world. No father, no mother, no brothers, no sisters, no grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, nothing, alone in the world. So he said during the day when they studied in the yeshiva and the Beis Medrash, learning kept them occupied and distracted from their thoughts. But at night when they lay down to sleep, sleep evaded them. And you could hear the sounds of sobbing in the yeshiva quarters where these teenage boys would sleep. Night after night, sobbing, realizing that they're alone in the world. Thank God they had each other as friends. Eventually, the good news came. The American embassy in Shanghai had received visas for them to enter the United States. There were no passenger ships yet. The war had just ended. They managed to get to America aboard an American military ship. It wasn't very comfortable at all. But they came to San Francisco. In San Francisco, there was big welcoming committees for these newly arrived survivors, Jewish survivors who were spared the Holocaust. And they were welcoming celebrations for them and press conferences. And these was not only Jews, these were Jews who dressed like Jews, who looked like Jews. Yeshiva Bocher. Went by train to Chicago, another reception, and eventually came to New York and were with the previous Rebbe for a few years until his passing in 1950. Then my father was a chassid of our Rebbe until his passing. My father passed away in 1991. He married my mother, who was a daughter of the Gabbai of the Rebbe Shul, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon, my mother Esther Aleha Shalom, in 1949, and raised a family, 4 children, any more grandchildren. And when he passed away at age 91, he had over 80 great-grandchildren. And he left, sorry, I didn't, did I say 1991? So I didn't pass away. He was age 91. He passed away a few years ago. And 2014. He left over 100 blood descendants. And every time a new great-grandchild would be born, he would clutch this little baby to his chest, to his heart. And we all knew what he was thinking, that Hitler, Yamach Shemoy, did not have the last word, that my father outlived him and his cohorts and was able to rebuild his family. And Baruch Hashem, there are still more great-grandchildren being born, and please God, many more still to come in the years ahead. And so when my father passed away, he was a qualified rabbi and shaykhid, but he made his living owning a kosher butchery for many years in Flatbush. But he was an asken. He was a communal activist. He was on the board of the Beis Rivka schools, the big Chabad girls' school in Crown Heights, which he and his colleagues saved from near bankruptcy, and they got involved in a management committee and saw it to success. He ran the Gemilas Chesed. From the house, he was always seeing people at home giving interest-free loans. And he was proud that many of his children and grandchildren are around the world serving Jewish communities in different capacities on shlichus and serving communities in many ways as oiskim b'tzorchei tzibur be'amuna. So Yehi Zichre Baruch, may his memory be blessed. There's lots more to tell, but that's it for now. And we're going to move over to Rabbi Stern, who's going to give us a shir on relevant topics. And he'll also give us the schedule for the rest of the day with Mincha and the end of the fast just now. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. And please God, may this day of destruction and sadness be transformed very quickly to a day of joy with the coming of Mashiach and the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. Amen.